So everybody's seated. We might have to get going because the ones have been poured and they're sitting in the glasses, and the longer they sit in there, and the less likely is that we can fully appreciate the purpose of the thing, which is to give everybody a possibility to taste wines that have been. So this is the same wine, bottled on the same day, so there's no issue here related to bottling consistency. So the wines, the bottling conditions have been measured, and we can ensure you that wines have been bottled under consistent conditions across the whole bottling session. The only difference here is the closure that was used to seal the bottles. So the permeability of the closure. So essentially, the amount of oxygen that went in the bottle. This is the first one you'll be tasting is a Sauvignon Blanc, and you have two closures references. Now, the wines are pretty young. It's a pretty fresh, fruity style of Sauvignon Blanc. It's been in bottles for 3.5 months, so not a lot. So keep in mind that over the longer you go, the broader the sensory spectrum that you would experience due to closure is, because the amount of oxygen comes in on a daily basis, and the differences will build up over time. But we thought it'd be interesting to taste a young wine so that from a market perspective and from that point of view, people can relate to something that hasn't been on the shelves for 2, 3, 5 years, but something that's more realistic for in terms of how long the wine stays in a bottle for today's market. So taste the wines. I don't know if you already tasted them. Have a sniff, have a sip, and in a few seconds, in a few minutes, we can have a chat about it. It's a very informal setting. We're not going to ask people to tell us about the fruity versus grapefruit versus oxidation reduction. But think about what type of response you get, whether you see differences, whether you have a preference for one or the other in case you see differences. And then they start to pour a red wine, which will be the second part of the tasting. Here the differences is only 2 closures. It's all blind. We're going to reveal the closures later. We don't want to influence people.
It's a blend. I think the right one's more out. But it's not. Do you get less bitterness? I get really.
Okay. Everybody's tasted the wines? As I was saying, we keep it blind for the moment, and then after we share some thoughts, we will reveal which closure was what. But my first question will be for people whether they perceive the wines as differences. I think there is a difference. I see particularly a difference regarding to the character of the fruit flavors in the wine. That's very much, for me, the main aspect. Maybe a little bit on the palate as well. So raise of hand for people who feel that the wine on the left has overall a more intense fruit character. So left, more intense. Would you describe that more as citrusy or more ripe fruit aromas for the wine on the left? So the wine on the left is more intense in fruity aromas. They seem to be more ripe fruit aromas, and it is rounder on the palate. What about the wine on the right? So do you see that as being less intense in fruit aromas? Of course. What about any character that anybody is willing to mention about the wine on the right? Less acidic. Okay, so it's a bit less punchy on the palate. Okay. So wine on the right is perceived a bit less acidic. What about the fruity aromas? Anybody? Very mineral character. A bit flinty. Okay. Right. Well, the wine on the left, it doesn't have that flinty character. Okay. It's more dominated by some fruity aromas. Right? Is that what more people are saying? The wine on the left is more fruit intense, while the other one is more flinty characters. Okay, that's quite interesting. Any other comment people willing to make? So, raise of hands for people who prefer the wine on the left. Anybody preferring the wine on the right? Okay, the people who prefer the wine on the right, what's your main character to attribute a preference? Somebody was mentioning is less acidic, so on the palate it feels better. People that preferring the wine on the right are sharing their view is more a palate thing, or there's something on the aroma as well? I think people down there were preferring the wine on the right. Right. So what's the character that you think it works better? Is that, somebody was saying, is there a mineral character in there that comes across? Sorry, more? Okay, so a bit of a floral character comes on the nose. Okay. And the people who prefer the wine on the left, they tend to prefer it for what reason? It's more an aroma thing, more a palate thing? Right, so it's more a Sauvignon Blanc character that you feel in this wine. So the sort of fruity, passion fruit character seem to express better in the wine on the left. Okay, so the wine on the left is sealed with a closure allowing very little oxygen. It's our Select 100, which we do believe works quite well on the majority of Sauvignon Blancs. The wine on the right is sealed with a Select 300, which is a closure that we tend to think is more suitable for some very reductive Sauvignon Blanc where you have a risk of building up those reductive aromas. But it probably work well on Chardonnays, on some Pinot Grigios, on that style of wine. But it's interesting that some people have mentioned the mouthfeel character, and some people have a preference for the wine on the right because it's perceived less acidic, because it links back to something we heard in the session today. Although it was more in the context of a red wine, this mouthfeel character that comes, it softens as you get more oxygen coming in the bottle. So some of the people seem to be perceiving that as one attribute that makes the wine on the right more preferable, although there were not many people, so it seemed to be that the aroma, the nose aspect, and the fact that it's more Sauvignon Blanc character seem to dominate the preference in this case. I think one of the interesting thing that comes across is that pretty much everybody felt that the wines were different. So a reasonably short period in the bottle with two closures that we still feel, compare also to today's market and compare especially to natural cork. These are pretty tight. These are pretty tight oxygen ingress levels. It's still enough to make a difference. Nobody's picked reductive characters, so they're tight but not extremely tight. Some minerality, comments around minerality came from somebody down there. So we're building up some stories around the sulfur compounds, as we say this morning, the fruity thiols in the Sauvignon Blanc versus some minerality. And I guess, again, you know, the preference is not 100% for one closure. So again, it tells you that different wines will benefit from different closures, and consumers are going to react to that in a different way. So it's all about the winemaker's intention, where you want your wine to be, where you think your consumers are going to be, how long you think your wine is going to be in the bottle. And so putting all that in the equation and trying to come out with something that will work for you and for somebody else will be a different decision again. So red wines are being poured. So the idea is to do the same exercise with the red wines. So taste them, talk about them, and then reveal what they are. But in that case, we will have three, against the same wine. It's a Chianti wine that you have in the reds. So Chianti's been a year and a half in bottle, so here you experience a longer bottle aging, which is quite relevant for this type of wine. You have three different oxygen levels, so oxygen ingress levels in the bottle, so it will be a little bit more complicated tasting, but I guess we'll give a fuller picture. And I think in the case of red wine, it's quite interesting because we see that we've seen in some of the presentations today that the range of oxygen that we can play with in a red wine is broader without having to worry too much about oxidation over a relatively short period of time, of course. And so I think it's interesting to have a range of 3 oxygen levels here. Maybe if I can have my range as well at my table, that would be good. Everybody's tasted the wines? Okay, again, first question. Are people feeling that these wines are different or that you're tasting the same wines? Raise of hands for people who feel the wines are different. Okay, majority of people think they are. For those who think that they're different, do you think you're tasting three wines, three different wines, or would you say that three different wines? Raise of hands for people who feel the three wines are completely, well, reasonably different one from each other. Okay, so most of the people think there's probably two styles of wines there, not really three styles of wines. Okay, so most people seem to think that here we have two styles of wines, really. I thought the same. Do you have a preference? People preferring wine on the left. Okay, so people preferring wine in the middle. All right. People preferring the wine on the right. I guess all the other ones. Okay. So those who prefer the wine on the left, would you be able to articulate a little bit some comment regarding why you like it? Is it like a mouthfeel or is it like a nose character? Will people agree with that? The people who prefer this wine, they along the same lines? Both aroma and palate, or more aroma perception, more palate characters? Mouthfeel. So mouthfeel softer? Okay. People who prefer the wine in the middle. I can't remember, they were a little bit everywhere, but somebody who preferred the wine in the middle, is there a reason for your preference? Right, so people like being in the middle there. Just it blends some characters of one on the left and one on the right, so it was the best compromise, essentially. Right. Right. There were some people preferring the ones on the right. Stefan is very strong about it, Jeff too. Why would that be, Stefan? For you, it's got a Chianti character. And in terms of, if you could relate to the comments we had, like on a mouthfeel side of things, you will feel it softer, more astringent. You can feel it. It feels like Italy. Okay. Feels like Italy. Other people willing to comment on this wine? So the other were harsher for you.
You were using the term minerality to refer to some aromatics like red stone or something in the previous and in your slides. There's kind of another use of it that I use, and this first wine has more of this sort of energetic buzz in the finish, perhaps we're tapping into its. I mean, a lot of Italian wines have this, and we do associate that with reduction. So. Yeah. And it seems that as the wine resolves and as it ages, that it loses some of that. So this is obviously a more age-worthy wine and it has a longer way to go, but that energy is interesting.
I do actually think that, to me, the wine on the left is a bit reductive, and not necessarily on the first one. Yeah, the wine on the left. Yeah. Yeah, a slightly stinky, smoky note. And so for me, it's not a preferred style, but, it's got certain characters that might appeal to people. Will people perceive any of the three wine having a reductive character that was unpleasant?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. The left side had slightly reductive character.
Right. But people don't feel generally that it was upsetting. Okay. At the beginning, people felt the majority of people didn't feel like these were three different wines. Most people felt like we had two groups of wines. So would you feel that the two similar wines are 1 and 2? How many people feel that the wines that are similar are 1 and 2? 2 and 3? 1 and 3? Okay. This is very interesting. It's very interesting from my point of view for two reasons. One, and I mean, you'll see because I'm trying to interpret it based on what the oxygen exposure levels here are. And it's interesting because people have said, I like the wine on the left because it's got nice balance of aroma and flavor and mouthfeel. And people that like the wine in the middle, they say the same thing. And people that like the wine on the right, they say the same thing. So the criteria for people to prefer one or the other seem to be the same. On a red wine, I really want the balance, the mouthfeel, and the aroma to come across in a nice way and so on. But then the way it translates into preference is completely different. So that's one first thing that probably addresses a little bit the fact that we use the same vocabulary or the same perception parameters, but then we interpret it in a different way when it comes to which one you prefer. So the balance, the equilibrium, the mouthfeel and the nose, and not too harsh and not too soft, it seems to apply to everybody, but then the way it translates into preference is completely different. Also, I think we have two wines here. One, the oxygen ingress, it goes from left to right, okay? And 1, 2, and 3 are closer in terms of oxygen ingress. They're more similar than number 1. But again, people are perceiving that the overall perception, some people feel 1 and 2 are similar, some others feel 2 and 3 are similar, but also, actually 2 and 3, not very many people, not the majority of people felt they were similar. More people felt 1 and 3 were similar, but they're at the extreme of the oxygen spectrum that we're testing. So that again makes it very interesting to interpret. But I guess the purpose of today was not very much to come with a final decision about one closure that is better than the other, or one oxygen level that is better than the other, but was to give people a perception of what range of wine styles you could create by playing with oxygen. Here is 18 months in the bottle, so it's a longer time. Some people are talking about, I think that there's a consensus around wine number 1 as a wine that has seen less oxygen, because some people were mentioning some sulfury, mineral, smoky characters, which seem to fit with the way I have presented this morning the chemical properties of these compounds and the sensory properties. Not everybody likes that character, or not everybody prefers that character. So again, having more or less of that is a matter of preference again. But you see how it can make a strong difference in the wine perception. And then the mouthfeel side of things, which I think everybody agrees that these ones are different in the way they attack on the palate and they perceive on the palate. But again, it doesn't seem to be a strong consensus around which one express that character in a preferential way. So I don't know if it'd be interesting to segment the audience in terms of maybe age or geographical origin, or what you eat at home, what you like to pair your wine with, or whether you drink more often a Cabernet or whether you drink a Chianti very often or not. Me, I'm Italian, so I tend to agree with Stefan saying that the wine on the right is a more Chianti style. It's got a certain characters that seem to fit on an image level more with the Chianti idea for me. So I don't know if people want to share other thoughts around these 3 wines, or the general perception around oxygen, the way it was able to influence that. Do you feel like this is something that in your winemaking strategies becomes relevant? Like create this level of differences that you can introduce them in a wine. Would you rate them enormous or negligible or interesting? How many people will rate this negligible? Like, it doesn't really matter. Like any other winemaking factor will be bigger than this. How many people feel is in the range of winemaking variables that makes a difference? Okay, so well, it's interesting because we have, I think, majority of people here are winemakers, so how many people think this is the most incredible winemaking variable you could ever apply to your winemaking process? Like, it makes enormous difference. Okay, so we got at least one. Okay. No, well, I guess it's just, yeah, I tend to see this as sitting where a lot of other winemaking factors are contributing. I think is You know, we know about a lot of other winemaking factors from previous work. You know, the yeast, we understand it, the grape quality. But it was the purpose of this tasting was to bring a level of visibility to this, an ability to compare. We understand that the comparative element is what sometimes is missing in winery trials. And so it was the purpose of bringing this today. So thanks again for being here. Thanks for your contribution to this little discussion. And you can keep enjoying the wines. I presume there will be more wines. No? Okay. Sorry. Okay, these ones are select 500 and 700, the middle and the left, and the right, sorry. And the one on the left is a product from competition that is much lower in oxygen ingress. So I'm not going to tell you which one it is because it will not be fair. But you see the range now is broader, which is quite relevant for a white wine. And we have closures that allow oxygen ingress that are in between the one on the left and the one in the middle. So you can sort of figure out. But in this trial, the winery where we did the trial was not interested in having those mid to low levels of oxygen in the trial. So we went for something higher and something lower, which was their reference closure. So no more questions? Okay, you can enjoy the wines then.
Thank you.